Sonny Dykes spoke after practice today and discussed two defensive players that have really stood out to him. One of them has switched positions and one of them is a transfer. So technically kind of newcomers, which is interesting. Frogs come in at 16th in the first coaches poll of the season. And did TCU almost accept a Pac-12 invite? Mac Engel had an interesting story about that. All that and more coming up next on Locked On Horned Frogs.
You are Locked On Horned Frogs, your daily podcast on the TCU Horned Frogs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Horned Frogs. I'm your host, Steven Simcox. It is your team every day. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also find us wherever it is you get podcasts and its audio variety. TCU resumed practice today, had the day off on Sunday, but Monday they were back out there getting ready for that Colorado game in a few weeks. And Sonny Dykes spoke after practice. We'll discuss some of the notes that he had here in segment one. We have a coaches poll, AP poll, which is the media. That comes out. That preseason poll will come out next Monday. But the college coaches, they voted this week in their preseason poll, and TCU comes in at number 16, and an interesting story about the Frogs in the Pac-12. But we will start with TCU football practice today. And Sonny Dykes spoke with the media after practice on Monday and had some interesting thoughts. One thing that really stood out to me, he talked about the defense. And I've mentioned this over the last few weeks. Sonny seems really high on this defensive line. Like, I know that's one thing that I'm personally concerned about. A lot of you have mentioned it. You know, do they have the depth? Do they have the ability to stay up and, maintain that push, be able to reestablish line of scrimmage at the defensive line position, pressure the quarterback with Dylan Horton moving on to the NFL? And he seems to feel comfortable with it. And one guy that he mentioned that's sort of a wild card is Rick DeBreu. And I talked about Rick DeBreu when he committed. He's an East Carolina transfer. The numbers don't pop off the page, kind of similar to Tico Brown. Now, Tico Brown, who came over from Central Michigan, is mainly an interior defensive lineman. Things can shift and change when you're in that three-down line front, but I think he's going to be at that nose position primarily. Rick DeBreu is a pass rusher. Really impressive frame, 6'2", 245. Only had 1.5 sacks in 2022, but he only played in 3 games. And so when you think of in that context, that's pretty special. Now, in 2021, that was his best season. 33 tackles total, 3.5 sacks. And for his career, he's a guy that has 6 sacks, over 4 seasons. Didn't play a ton in East Carolina his first couple years at TCU, but had a really good year in 2021, injured in 2022, then hits the transfer portal and ends up with the Horned Frogs in Fort Worth for this upcoming season. And so, again, the stats aren't mind-blowing, but did have a really productive season a couple of years back. Sonny says he thinks he's a guy that can really help them in rushing the passer, that he's a great athlete, that he came in, he's in shape, he's ready to rock and roll. He didn't go through spring practice, so don't have a ton of information on him yet. But in this 3-3-5 scheme, you don't always ask defensive linemen to get to the quarterback on a consistent basis. Like, it's not their main function. It's more, taking up space, filling gaps, not allowing linemen to climb up to the second level and hound your linebackers. But if you have a dynamic, twitchy edge player, then that's a huge plus. And I think it's going to be a combination of guys this year. But it sounds like Rick DeBreu is the type of guy that in certain situations could be really effective. It's not going to necessarily be every single time. He's not going to be a 3-down line or a 3-down player where he's in there in first, second, and third down. But in more obvious pass rush situations, could he be someone that could get to the quarterback? I think that's a huge positive if that's the case. Another player that was mentioned, not a transfer, someone who played last season but has switched positions. So Nnamdi Abizor was a safety last year, and he is now a linebacker, moved down the linebacker position. And when I first heard about this, I thought that kind of makes sense. I mean, Nnamdi's pretty big size. He's kind of similar to Mark Perry in like size and build, a little lankier than Mark. But with the safety position in this defense, I mean, you have safeties that sort of play as linebackers, right? You have guys that are more apt to get the job done in run support, that play more physically. And Namdi was one of those players. And so last season, I mean, he had a really good year. Like, I didn't realize that on the season he had 49 tackles, had 31 solo tackles. And I remember specific games where he played super well. Like, I remember the Kansas State game during the regular season where he was fantastic. He was all over the field, made some plays, really brought the wood when he was, making tackles. And so he moved down to linebacker, and I thought, well, that makes sense. But this linebacker room, in my mind, was pretty stacked with Terrence Cooks coming back from injury and guys like Johnny Hodges and Jamoy Hodge, who played a ton of snaps last year, Shad Banks, Marcel Brooks coming back into the fold. They had a lot of options. Thomas Armstrong is another player that Sonny mentioned today that's sort of working his way back from an injury, got a little banged up, but is hopefully someone they can count on this year for some quality snaps. But Namdi has been running with the ones so far all during fall camp. And to hear somebody say it, he's really been impressive. And I know, like, listening and watching the guys that are at practice every day, he's making tackles behind the line of scrimmage. He's making things happen in run support. And I talked about this with Marcel Brooks earlier this week, like that star position that's sort of, an outside linebacker in this defense. It's the slot that D. Winters played last year. And D's not necessarily the prototypical type of player for that role. But Baylor had a lot of success in this position with Jalen Petrie, and Jalen was sort of a guy that floated around for a few years at Baylor, and then his last couple seasons under Ron Roberts and Dave Aranda just became an outstanding defensive, player because he found a really good fit as sort of a hybrid linebacker safety. And so it seems like Nnamdi Abizor is getting into that position and filling that role really nicely so far in practice. So that would be a surprise if he ends up being your starting linebacker. And, hey, if the coaching staff's comfortable with him, then that's fantastic. I'm not going to question it, but definitely not the guy that I would have penciled in when fall camp started. And there's still a lot of weeks here, and the depth chart changes frequently, but not the guy that I would have guessed early in fall camp would be kind of sitting there with a chance to start moving positions from safety down to that linebacker spot. And, yeah, there's some shared responsibilities there, but at the same time, I thought there might be a bigger learning curve, but apparently not. And so good for him that he is impressing early in camp. Sonny also said they stayed pretty healthy so far. John Lands, one of the offensive linemen that switched out a lot with Wes Harris last year, he should be cleared by the end of the week and ready to get in there and practice. And so we should get a better idea in theory over the next week or so of what this O-line is going to look like. But, yeah, Rick Abreu and Nnamdi Abizor getting some praise today from Coach Dykes as guys that could step up and be, maybe under the radar stars for this defense this season. And I feel so good. Like, I was on the radio today doing a spot about TCU season, and I really feel good about this defense. Like, I think the secondary at the corner position with Josh Newton and Avery Helm, they're going to be fantastic at covering receivers, being physical, staying with them, a lot of speed there between Helm and Newton. And then at the safety position, they have so much experience with all those guys coming back. I think that's going to be a solid spot for them. Linebacker, that room is very talented. It really, to me, just comes down to the defensive line. And maybe my concerns are outdated because it appears that Coach Dykes feels really good about where this team is moving forward on the defensive line. And if they truly are 9 or 10 players deep up front, then I think there's significantly less questions with Joe Gillespie's squad and what they can do in year 2 of this system as they kind of get their feet under them and move forward as a team. And that O-line is interesting. Once John Lands comes back, Willis Patrick, Colton Deary, and then they've kind of experimented with bringing Brandon Coleman inside at times too. And Coleman and Coker were your 2 tackles last year. If Coleman slides inside, I think, he'll either be like Mike Nichols or Tommy Brockermeyer, who could be your other tackle. I would guess Mike Nichols just because he's been in the program longer. But that would be a change. I mean, I really thought Coleman and Coker – there had been some talk about maybe moving Coleman inside, but they started so many games last year at those tackle positions. I felt like that was just going to be, the way it was. But one thing about this O-line is D-line too, and I'm going to get to something kind of funny that happened tonight too with something I sent on Twitter. But this is a big team. I mean, I think, Coach Kaz is a huge part of that, right? Like he is doing some special things with the strength and conditioning program. But Sonny talked a lot last year about he thought when they got to TCU, one of the first things they sort of noticed as a coaching staff was this is a very physical football team. That was the strength that they had, and they wanted to maintain that identity. And it seems like, especially up front, and maybe it was, maybe like it was a Georgia game too. In games that they lost, Georgia and K-State, where they faced really good players up front and kind of got pushed around at times. Maybe it was that led to this energy and effort to get bigger up front. But, man, they got some serious size on the offensive and defensive line. And so I'm excited to see how that plays out. Those are your fall camp notes for today. When we come back, TCU football, they're sitting at number 16 in the coaches poll. Is that right? We'll run down the top 25 next here on Locked On Horned Frogs. I do want to talk about LinkedIn jobs, though. LinkedIn.com/LockedOnCollege. You can go to that website today, and the great thing about it is you can post your job for free. That's right. Not a typo, not a scam. You can post that job for free. If you are in the business of hiring people, or if you own a small business, this is something that you know well. You have to find the right people. There is nothing that wastes your time more than finding people who can't do the job right or are not a good culture fit for your business. And that can leave you reeling for weeks, months. It's just a tough thing to recover from. So don't leave this up to chance. Go to LinkedIn.com/LockedOnCollege. LinkedIn jobs, we all know what LinkedIn is. It's the number one source. When people think of, hiring, finding a job, the first thing they think of, I got to go to LinkedIn, right? Everybody has a LinkedIn profile. It's one of the things at TCU I was told all the time. You need to make a LinkedIn profile. That's the way to introduce yourself to the professional world, is to have a LinkedIn profile. You can go to LinkedIn.com/LockedOnCollege and post your job for free. Again, post your job for free there. They have a purple #hiring frame that you can put the job posting in, and they have simple screening questions that allow you to, narrow down that list and find the right people for your business. Again, it's why LinkedIn jobs is ranked number one when it comes to small business owners. LinkedIn.com/LockedOnCollege and LinkedIn jobs. They are a proud sponsor of the Locked On Network. So something funny that happened today, and we will get to the coaches poll here in a minute, but I check the roster frequently on TCU's website, gofrogs.com, just to kind of see what's happening, what the team looks like. It's also the best place to find out if and who is off the team, potentially if there's rumors. They're pretty good about updating, like, hey, this person's profile is no longer on their website. That's a great indication that they are no longer on the football team. And so I was looking this afternoon because Alex Frank had asked me, like, is there any chance that Chance Nolan, no pun intended there, would be back next season? We talked a lot about him leaving yesterday. And Jeremy Clark originally reported that he had left the team. I saw Steven Johnson, beat reporter for the Fort Star Telegram, also say on Twitter today that, yes, he was gone, and he's off the website. But while I was looking through the website, I noticed, there's, it looks like updated weights. It looks different. Like the weight and height looks different than it did before for some players. And so I was sort of scrolling through, and I came across one of TCU's recruits from the 2023 class that is on campus right now, offensive lineman from South Oak Cliff, Bubba Ramsey Brooks. And Bubba, which is his nickname because he's a big guy, in high school he was listed at 380. That was his weight, 6'5", 380. And so, that's a huge dude. And you look at Bubba and, you see it. Like, you see a massive human. And like, we all, got people that played high school football, or if you've been around high school football, there are players at the high school level that are just huge. They're just huge. They're just large humans, right? They're bigger than everyone else. But they might not be the best players necessarily. As an offensive lineman, there's a lot of footwork involved. There's a lot of athleticism that you have to have, quickness, ability to, stay in front of guys, right? Like, that's a huge part of it. It's not just brute strength and fighting somebody in a phone booth. But if you watch Brooks's highlight tape, Like, this is a special player. I mean, he's not just a statuesque left tackle that edge rushers can simply not run around because he's so big. He's an interior offensive lineman, and he did a great job for a state championship winning team at Oak Cliff. And so, I mean, this is going to be a process with him. Like, I think they're going to have to find a way to get his body slimmed down and get him to a place where he can move and have the quickness he needs to have to play at the Power 5 college level. But they have him listed on the Go Frogs website at 455 pounds, which is crazy. And so Marshall Newhouse, former TCU great, longtime NFL offensive lineman, he replied to my tweet because I sent it out on Twitter. I was like, hey, this guy's going to be a fan favorite. Just look at the size. And it's gotten picked up and it's gotten shared around. It got retweeted by like Spencer Hall, who's one of my favorite college football writers. But anyway, it made the rounds today. Okay. And so, but I say that to like get to this point. Marshall Newhouse, former TCU offensive lineman, replied and was like, this would be fantastic, but I don't really buy this. If he was 380 in high school, I can't see a world where Coach Kaz would let him, bulk up to 455. And I would tend to agree with Marshall because he obviously knows football better than me. And yeah, everybody's thought was, okay, you get in there with Coach Kazadi, he's going to try to get you slimmed down to a place where you can play at a better weight. But I will say, like, he's just a huge person. And yes, typically they fudge the numbers on the official roster. I'm not sure that he was 380 in high school, though. Like, he's just a big guy. So we'll see. It's just sort of a funny thing that happened. But they have him listed at 455 on the website, which is wild. And I think it was a great pickup by TCU. He's an interesting player. I don't know what his future holds, but he's a fun personality, and he was a really good high school offensive lineman. And so I don't think it was, just this massive – some people think that was like a massive risk taking his commitment, but I don't get that impression. I think he's got the tools to be really good, but it's going to take some time to get to a place where he can get on the field. Transitioning a little bit. So coaches poll came out today. AP coaches poll came out today. No surprise. Georgia is number one. Not unanimous, but they did get the majority of the first place votes. So Georgia at 1, Michigan at 2. The Frogs, of course, defeated in the college football playoff. Alabama at 3, Ohio State at 4, LSU at 5. LSU getting a lot of love this year. Year 2 of Brian Kelly. After that tough loss, I think it was Florida State in the opener last season. They did turn things around nicely. USC at number 6 in year 2 of Lincoln Riley. At 7, Penn State. 8, Florida State. At 9, Clemson. At 10, Tennessee. At 11, Washington. And at 12, your first Big 12 team, Texas, who is picked to win the conference and is getting a lot of hype and steam this offseason. At 13, Notre Dame. At 14, future Big 12 team Utah. 15, Oregon. At 16, there is TCU. At 17, Kansas State. 18, Oregon State. Oklahoma at 19, coming off that 6-7 season in year 1 of the Brett Venables experience. At 20, North Carolina. Wisconsin 21. Ole Miss 22. Tulane 23. Texas Tech 24. And Texas A&M 25. So the Frogs at 16th, and we've discussed a lot about, or we've had a lot of discussions about TCU being disrespected this year. Are they not getting the benefit of the doubt? But I honestly feel like 16 is pretty fair. I have questions about Texas. I think a lot of this for UT hinges on the play of Quinn Ewers, who wasn't very good last season. I know he was dealing with an injury at times, but I didn't come away just super impressed with the way he played, right? They lost Bijan Robinson. Now they have an outstanding receiving core. Jordan Whittington's fantastic. I know he's not the first person that comes to mind for a lot of people, but the Cuero product is really special. If he can stay healthy, he'll be great. They also have Xavier Worthy on the outside, who, if Quinn can connect with him, then should be fantastic. A.D. Mitchell from Georgia, the speedster, Jatavian Sanders, the tight end. They have all the talent, right? But got them at 12, the coaches do. And so that's your first Big 12 team. I'm not really shocked by anybody in the top 5. And again, that was Georgia at 1, Michigan 2, Alabama 3, Ohio State 4, and then LSU at 5. Curious to see where the media has the Frogs. And right above K-State, which is at 17, which I get that. I mean, K-State was picked to finish second in the Big 12 media poll, but, they lost a lot too. Tommy Fisher pointed that out. Like, they lost Deuce Vaughn, who was the engine of that offense. Will Howard will be your full-time starter this season, which I think will end up being beneficial to the Wildcats because he was going back and forth, between Adrian Martinez last year. They lost some production on that defense. Like, they're also replacing a lot. I just think Chris Kleiman's a good coach, and they have a pretty high floor. Like, they don't seem like a team that's just going to completely bottom out, but there is some transition happening there. 16 in my mind seems pretty fair. But if you want to comment here on YouTube, or if you want to tweet at me at SimcockSteven, let me know what you think about TCU sitting there at number 16 in the AP Coaches Poll. And again, that media poll is going to come out next Monday. There's not a lot of egregious stuff happening here, though. Like Texas at 12, I think that's pretty solid. They're picked to win the league. It's not like they're coming in top 5 in the coaches poll. And at 16, if that's where they end up, around there in the media poll, that gives you a chance if you go and beat Colorado pretty handily, and then you win games against Houston and SMU, you're sitting in a pretty good spot going into conference play. So I think that's a good place for the Frogs to be. There's not just overwhelming hype sitting there at 16th in the country, but it's a solid place to begin the season. And so we'll see sort of where they go from here once the season starts. When we come back, do the Frogs almost accept a Pac-12 invitation? We'll close out the show with that here on Locked On Horned Frogs. So Matt Kingle from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, longtime columnist, he wrote the story. Actually, the story came out a few days ago, but I must have missed it. I came across it today, though. And it was about Jeremiah Donati and sort of his thoughts on realignment. And obviously, he's super excited that TCU is in the Big 12, that TCU has a seat in the table with all the musical chairs with realignment lately. But in a quote here, it says, Donati realizes there are also real people involved in the remaining 4 Pac-12 schools, people at Stanford, people at Cal, people at Oregon State, and people at Washington State. He goes on to say that he grew up around the Wazoo athletic department, grew up around Washington State's facilities. His dad was a team physician there, spent time as an intern in the Washington State athletic department, and met Chris Del Conte at Washington State. So he has ties there. He said in a quote, "It's bittersweet because there's a feeling of relief and remorse. I speak for my colleagues. We spent a lot of time reflecting on the ramifications of these actions because they're essentially putting a conference out of business." And that is what the Big 12 along with the Big 10 did. I mean, it remains to be seen what's going to happen with the last 4 teams in the Pac-12. I know Stanford and Cal have apparently had some meetings with the Big 12 and the ACC about possibly moving. Washington State and Oregon State, unfortunately for them, seem like they're kind of on an island in the Pacific Northwest with not a ton of options. And I said this the other day. I was like, when's the last time a major conference just went under like this? Was it the Southwest Conference back in the 90s? Now, someone pointed out the Big East, which is a good point, and the Big East didn't completely fold, but they're no longer involved in football. It's an all-basketball conference, and by all accounts, it's lost a ton of relevancy since that happened. However, it still exists, and I'm not sure in what way or what capacity the Pac-12 is going to exist in the near future because of everything that's happening here. And Donati said he had familiar feelings back in 2021 when Texas and Oklahoma announced they were leaving. And here is the fascinating part to me. He said after USC and UCLA announced they would leave, and the Pac-12 has famously been very anti-expansion. When Texas and OU left and schools across the Big 12 were like, well, we need a new place to go. Maybe the Pac-12 would make sense. Pac-12 didn't have any interest in adding teams, right? Even after Colorado left and there were only 9 teams in the conference, at least publicly, the Pac-12's position was, well, we just kind of want to see what happens. We want to get this media deal done first. And once we get the media deal figured out, then we'll explore expansion. They just had no clear vision for how they want to move forward. And I think ultimately, towards the end, it was teams seeing presidents and ADs seeing the writing on the wall and saying to themselves, you know what, it's probably best if we just move on. But bottom line is they weren't looking to expand. Even then, it wasn't happening. But when USC and UCLA left, the Pac-12 briefly explored expansion. And Mac Engel says that there was almost an invitation to Houston and TCU, and that Houston and TCU would have said yes. That would have been absolutely insane. After it would have made a ton of sense to me if after Texas and OU left, if the Pac-12 did give a life raft to TCU, if Jeremiah Donati and Chancellor Boschini and everyone said, yeah, we got to go. Like, ship might be sinking, and we got to move on. But when USC and UCLA left, the Pac-12 was pretty vulnerable. And I understand why TCU would entertain the notion of moving to the West Coast, but it's crazy to me to put it that plainly and to say like they would have accepted that in the moment. But the invite never came. Ultimately, the Pac-12 decided, you know what, we're going to stay pat. We're going to hold off for now, try to get this TV deal figured out, and then we'll move forward. I keep saying Pac-10. It's the Pac-12. I'm sorry. But the Pac-12 said, we're just going to stay where we are right now, and we'll explore expansion at a later time. But how insane would it have been? Now, I don't know if all this goes down. Like if TCU and Houston joined and got it back to 12 teams, maybe there's a different situation here with the TV deal. Maybe that would have pushed executives to be like, all right, well, you got 12 teams. You're in Texas now. And they would have come up with a deal that was similar to where the Big 12 is. But if not, I mean, TCU would be sitting in the same position that a lot of Pac-12 schools are right now, which is searching desperately for a new home. So I would love to hear more backstory on that and what happened in the days leading to that decision. But just kind of a crazy update there that TCU at least entertained the notion of moving on to the Pac-12 at a time where it was pretty unstable and the league was interested in TCU and Houston and trying to get the DFW and Houston market. We'll be back tomorrow and we'll have more for you as we continue to roll along here on Locked On Horned Frogs. It's your team, and again, we do it every day.